Hello, it's Scott Manley here. If there was a popularity contest for, computer flight simulators, Microsoft Flight Sim would be winning that by a long way. It would be cruising high above the flight levels at Mach 3 like an SR-71 compared to, say, X-Plane, which would be happily flipping all the switches in a 747 at a mere 30,000 feet. While lots of pilots value realistic simulation of their aircraft, more people value really cool looking scenery and lots of things to do. And in the last few weeks, we have just had the release of Microsoft Flight Sim 2024, and you have probably heard that there were a lot of problems with the launch. I never experienced any of those because they never even bothered to send me a key until 2 weeks after the launch, and by that point I was out of town, and so I only just got to install it, and the experience was flawless, to be honest. There was no problem at all. They've at least solved those real showstopper issues at launch, but that is not to say that it is a bug-free experience. And some of the hasty bug fixing that has been performed in the last couple of weeks has centered around disabling features that we would really like to use. So the massive new feature, which is sort of backbone to all the new content, is campaign mode, where you start out as a new pilot, learning your skills, you gotta take your tests. As you take tests, you unlock ratings in new classes of aircraft. And in many ways, it mirrors real-life pilot training, where you have to demonstrate your skills in check rides, and there you get ratings and endorsements, and you unlock new power-ups in the form of better and cooler and possibly weirder aircraft. So you start out by picking a home field, and obviously I went with Novato, NOS field, Kilo Delta Victor Oscar, because it is my real home field. And then you're introduced to Tex Costello, who will get you started on your career. Like everything else in the game, he is voiced by AI.
Welcome to NOS. I'm Tex, the owner of this aero club.
And as you can hear, the AI does not capture the true nature of the awesome, cool name that is Tex Costello. And then you get to see one of the new features where you walk around the plane. You can actually walk up and examine things like the struts, the wings, the flaps, and I'm gonna say it is surprisingly messy here. You keep on randomly hitting colliders, you don't know what, you'll get stuck. But, I'm sure it's fun if you want to look at your plane up close. On one hand, the purist in me wants to see some sort of negative consequence. If you don't do this inspection properly, if you miss that castellated nut missing the cotter pin. But on the other hand, I'd rather just get to flying. So the first flight they give you is in a Cessna 172 with a G1000. Interestingly, if you want a Cessna with steam gauges, you actually have to buy one of the more premium editions. And so anyway, you get out to the runway, and here comes my first and favourite bug in this. They tell you that, you're going to be flying around the traffic pattern, left pattern traffic. Now, that is a standard traffic pattern. That means you're turning left turns all the way around until you come back to the runway. That's normal at most fields, but not all fields and runways allow left traffic, and particularly at NOS field, which I have chosen, runway 31, it is right traffic. Why do they force right traffic on you? Well, if you look over to the left, you can see there is a mountain there. This is one of the most basic things a flight simulator should be able to do. It should be able to read the necessary navigation data for all the airports and know the approaches, know the traffic patterns, and it shouldn't be having flight instructors turning you into a mountain on takeoff on your first flight. It is, however, an extraordinarily good-looking mountain. And at least in my case, there's just enough room for me to get through there and make a turn and continue the mission after getting very, very close to the terrain to admire it. So yeah, let's be clear, this is where Microsoft Flight Simulator absolutely excels. Its rendition of the world is better than all the competitors by a long way. They have built up a world model using radar data from the space shuttle and other satellites. We've got satellite imagery, open street map with buildings. All of that has been converted into this version of the world. And it's so good that I do use Microsoft Flight Sim 2020 when I'm flying to unfamiliar areas so that I know what it looks like. When I was going to do my real check ride, it was supposed to be at NOS field, and then what happened was we had low ceilings and cover, I had to cancel it and go to a completely different airfield 100 miles away that I'd never been to. So the night before my check ride, I literally flew over there in Microsoft Flight Sim. I checked everything out to make sure that I knew visually what I would be seeing, and it helped me a whole lot. And since 2020, NOS Field has suddenly acquired a whole bunch of buildings that sort of look the right size, and more importantly, it has got the transmission towers that sit just east of the field. These are a really important landmark for pilots that are flying out of this field. On the other hand, there are small details that are missing that you would expect to see. Things like the tallest building on the west coast of the USA, completely missing from the skyline of San Francisco. And I think this is because the baseline of the data is like 10 years old now. But even with these emissions, it is still far above the competitors in terms of quality, and that means, paradoxically, that you want to get low down and get close to that scenery. And that means there's a lot of joy to be had in flying F-18s low through the Sidewinder transition. Or if you're in the UK, maybe the Mach Loop is more your speed. You can fly low over San Francisco Bay just like the Blue Angels do. Or fly down Market Street in San Francisco just like the Blue Angels don't. Yes, there is absolutely a world of possibilities and a lot of things you can do in a lot of different aircraft, but I thought it would be more educational to actually try and do something serious. Something that I can already do in 2020 or X-Plane 12. So I thought it would be good for me to do a simple instrument flight, exactly the kind of thing that I've been doing as part of my instrument rating. Now, I fly an SR-20, but in the sim, the one that they have is the SR-22T, which is a super duper better version with more horsepower and extra turbocharging. But the cockpit is broadly similar. You can go through the checklist on the G1000 on the right screen, and you can start programming a flight plan in. So this is going to be from NOS, which is Kilo Delta Victor Oscar, to Napa, Kilo Alpha Papa Charlie. It's a pretty short flight. Napa has an ILS that I'm going to use. I set up the clouds to be super low, so I have to fly in this ILS. Now, departing from NOS, because of that giant mountain to the west, you're required to turn out towards the east, and you have a VOR called Skaggs Island, and its code is Sierra Golf Delta. So if I put that in to the FMS, it tells me that it doesn't exist, despite the fact that I can actually see it on the map. Moreover, a minute later, when I'm setting up the instrument approach at Napa, one of the initial approach fixes is Skaggs Island, Sierra Golf Delta. So it's in there, it just can't find it. Okay, so with that in mind, I decided that I was just going to fly the first leg manually, more or less, using the VOR. You'll notice that if you look at the center display, the compass in the bottom, the green bearing line, that doesn't show a bearing until I get above the surface because, or the track error, that doesn't get shown until I get high enough that I'm picking up radio from that VOR. There's like a line of hills that get in the way. Now, yeah, this is, again, simulating an SR-22T, which is a whole lot faster and more powerful than what I usually fly. So it's picking up altitude a whole lot faster, getting the flaps in, and once I get to about 600 feet, that's when I'm going to begin standard rate turn out to the east, and hopefully, once I set this up, I'll be able to start tracking in towards my beacon and pick up altitude. The only thing is, I'm in the clouds now, but I'd really like to not have those points of interest floating out there. That's really unrealistic. And so sure, I'll go in and I turn those off for this, but then when I fly other missions later, some of the challenges, you actually need those reference points if you want to know what the challenge is expecting you to do. So now, in an effort to maximize the realism of flying aircraft, I turn on the autopilot, because autopilot management while flying approaches is actually a non-trivial thing. The Cirrus Autopilot has a bunch of different modes. You can make it follow a heading, follow the navigation that's in your flight plan. You can enable it to follow an approach, and of course then you have altitude controls and various ways of arming and disarming things. It's actually like a lot of work to figure out what mode it's going to go into next, and you kind of need to anticipate what's going to happen. But the nice thing about having the autopilot is that you can switch the camera outside and really admire stuff, really admire the beautiful graphics in this game. I mean simulation, obviously. I'm really using this as a training medium. Now, the frame rate's not great, by the way, you may have noticed. It's not getting perfect, silky smooth 60 frames per second. I am running this at 4K on a GeForce, 3070. It could probably use a faster graphics system, but at this point I'm kind of waiting to see what the 5000 series NVIDIA GPUs do. Anyway, look, I've cut out a whole bunch of faffing around as I tried to make sure I had all the right frequencies tuned in for my navigation radios, but finally I am on the procedure turn, so I'm going to come around and go inbound for the ILS on runway 01 left at Napa. Now, if you look at the center display, you'll notice that my navigation, right, it's now the magenta line right now, because we're flying this procedure turn using the GPS. But now I'm on final, I should be able to pick up the localizer, which is a radio beam coming out from the runway. So I hit the CDI button, switch it over, and no, let's keep it on nav. I accidentally switched it over to heading. I can see what I mean about managing the autopilot. Okay, so now my autopilot is following the localizer, the green line. And this is part of the ILS. The localizer provides horizontal guidance and the glide slope provides vertical guidance. They both use basically the same radio technology. Anyway, I'm running this like 4 times regular speed. We're headed in towards a fix called Chickpea. That's the final approach fix. That's where we intercept the glide slope. Right now we're actually below the glide slope that's provided by the ILS. And the autopilot is basically flying using altimeter, the barometric navigation to just hold certain altitudes. The thing to look for is in the central display on the right side you've got the altimeter. There is a green diamond which is slightly to the left and it is coming down. When that hits the middle, that's when you start following the glide slope. And again, the autopilot is set, it's armed, it's in approach mode, it's going to pick up the glide slope. There's the glide slope. It is now descending for me. I still have to manually adjust the power, of course. If I don't, then I will start to descend. Another thing I did just before this was I put in the flaps, which apparently there's a problem with the controls on this, and if you hit the flaps control on my external controller, it decided to deploy 100% flaps rather than doing 1 notch of flaps. Yeah, one of the big things about transitioning from one flight simulator to another is you pretty much need to go in and reassign all your controls. And I have a ton of external controllers and I am not looking forward to the amount of effort that it's going to take to reassign all these things, especially since one of the controllers I have is like a Garmin G507 autopilot control that I 3D printed and built with Arduinos and stuff, and it talks via serial to my computer. I had to hack that together to work in X-Plane, had to hack it to make it work on Microsoft Flight Sim, so I'm probably going to hack it a whole lot more. The reason I 3D printed my own autopilot controller, by the way, is because I wanted tactile controls, because I end up happening to use it a lot when you're flying a Cirrus. But never mind, back to this current approach. We are just passing 1,000 feet, and we are still in the suit, but we need to look outside. We're trying to see the runway. Now we can start to see some shadows of the terrain below us. That isn't good enough. We need to be able to see the runway before we reach our missed approach point, or specifically our missed approach altitude. This is a precision approach, which means we have vertical guidance, and so we have a height at which we have to decide if we can't see the runway, we have to perform a missed approach. For this ILS, it's 200 feet above the surface. The touchdown zone is 17 feet altitude, so 217 feet. But as it happens, we don't need to worry about that because that is the runway starting to show up right there. Excellent. Okay, so now let's put in the flaps. We're going to go from 50 to 100% flaps, and we are going to adjust our throttle to try and keep ourselves at a reasonable approach speed. And honestly, on an SR22, I don't know what that is. I know that the SR20 is 78 knots if it's pretty full. SR22 is heavier, so I want to make it fly a little bit faster into that final. I'm still flying on the autopilot at this point, and it's tracking the ILS, so let's cancel that. The ILS is off to the left of the runway, so now I'm flying this in manually, and it's just like any other approach. And pretty much flying visual at this point. So just, you want to keep your speed up. You don't want to go too fast because that changes your rollout distance. You don't want to go too slow, and I am actually below my glide slope because I'm sort of naturally aiming for the touchdown bars because I'm not an airliner. Don't worry, we're not going to crash. I'm going to perform a beautiful landing on the center line here, I'm sure. I mean, actually, the aircraft in Microsoft Flight Sim do have a tendency to float way more than the real things, as far as I can tell. There we go. Beautiful. On the runway. Now let's stay on the center line. Continue to maintain back pressure. Let things slow down naturally. Yeah, 50 knots. I'm not going to make this exit. Let's keep rolling until I see the next one. So yeah, look, despite the numerous newly introduced bugs, it does seem that the core simulation is mostly running. Certainly the G1000 emulation has a few rough edges here and there, but I'm pretty sure those rough edges were also in the original Microsoft, 2020. At this point, like, if you're going to buy a flight simulator, then should you consider 2024? Well, you shouldn't buy 2020 because it's the old version. And by the looks of things, 2020 is currently the same price. I think the only upside is that you get the actual Top Gun and Dune-themed content, which isn't in the 2024 version. But if you have to accept, if you buy 2024, you're going to be dealing with a bunch of bugs for a while. Also, the new version is supposed to be broadly compatible with all the old content, especially if you bought it. So, interestingly, I get given the Steam version, and you log in with your Microsoft Store and it shows all the purchases that I previously made on the Microsoft Store, so that stuff appears to copy over. X-Plane is obviously an option for people that want a slightly more realistic simulator if they don't care about the quality of scenery as much. And by the way, if you've got Linux or Mac, X-Plane is your option. Microsoft Flight Sim doesn't officially support those. And of course, if you want the highest fidelity simulations of military jets, then DCS has you covered. Honestly, this feels like a very Microsoft kind of upgrade. The latest OS comes out, but the early adopters have to deal with the bugs, whereas the people with the existing version, they take their time to migrate until everything is good in the new place, and there's features that they can't live without. So if you already own 2020, there will probably be a point that you go and buy 2024 just so you can get all the new content. And if you absolutely need to buy a flight sim this Christmas, 2024 will be a pretty good option, but it may not be perfect on day one. I'm Scott Manley, fly safe.